Folks, and by saying afternoon, that means it's a few minutes after 12, our starting time, which we are trying to respect for lots of reasons, partly the schedule of our guests, whom I'm going to introduce in a moment. We also have some people who are tuning in to watch us on Zoom, who are not in this room, a few people who have joined us from the community, and lots of you from here at 50 Kent. So my name is Rick Kober-Bauman, and for a couple more days, I get to introduce myself as the Director of MCC Ontario. Welcome to all of you. And this is one of a frequent but not regular series of lunch and learn or lunch and listen or brown bag lunches where we try to create an opportunity in this wonderful community space we have here to have guests who are either part of our MCC community, or sometimes they're part of the other organizations that make their homes here at 50 Kent. And then we make that a broad invitation so that the community that we think is part of why we built this place the way we did can be enriched by meeting others and are part of that broader community. So today, I get to introduce friends and colleagues, James and Joan Alty. They make their home now in Johannesburg, but for many years, what is called Manitoba Home, and at various parts have actually made their home here in Ontario. They're part of the Crossroads Mennonite Brethren Church in Winnipeg, and have been in Southern Africa since 08-09. Yeah. Were reps for a time and have now become the area directors for what we call the Southern Africa region. So if you look back here, you'll see Peter and Kath Woolner. I'm introducing them because they also have direct ties, having most recently served as interim reps in one of the parts of that area. So I had a little bit of time. We got to pick up Joan and James at the airport and spent some time together last evening, so I know a little bit of what they want to share today. And part of that has to do with tying into some work that MCC's been doing on Palestine, Israel. Any of you who work for MCC and have for the last half year should have had 3 different opportunities to be in seminars to learn about MCC's work in Palestine, Israel. James and Joan have been asked to describe their work in Southern Africa, and particularly South Africa, to make some parallels between the former apartheid and what we see happening in Palestine, Israel through the occupation. So, with that introduction, welcome James and Joan. And at about 20 past the hour or so, we're going to move from a formal presentation to Q&A. I don't know how religious I have to be about that, but that's what our folks externally are expecting. So, please, welcome here.
Thank you.
You got to stay in the big square. Otherwise, our good friends can't see you.
I get to start because I'm going to have a very small part of the presentation. And actually what Rick has just done was probably going to be the biggest content of what I was going to add. But I'll just tell you a little bit more about ourselves, and then James is going to take over. We do live in just south of Winnipeg on an acreage in Howden, Manitoba, which very few people would know, but unless you happen to live there. And we have 3 children who are 35, 32, and 27. James was on many MCC boards before we took positions overseas, and I was on MCC Manitoba board. We did start in August of 2008 as reps in what MCC has got as an administrative unit that includes Lesotho, Swaziland, and South Africa, and then became area directors on January 1st, 2016, and then we moved closer to Johannesburg for the year. This past year has been actually really busy for us. We started in January with the All Africa Peace Network meeting, which was peace workers for MCC that came together at MCETI, which is a conference center very close to where we live. And we had the wonderful experience of having Alan Reeser McDowell and Rick Kober-Bauman there for that meeting. along with someone that some of you may know, Issa Sadi Mbobola, who is now working with MCC Zambia. We also have hosted the Africa Peacebuilding Institute in August of this year, and on the last week we had 47 participants, which come from all over Africa and share about their work and learn about how to do it better. And we ended just before we left with a training that Chris Bowers, who most of you probably know, is the financial guru for MCC. And I'm going to now give James the hard work of doing the presentation.
Good afternoon. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to be here, and thank you for allowing us this time to share with you. For this portion of our talk, we are going to focus on South Africa in particular, rather than the broader Southern Africa region, and try and develop some parallels between modern-day South Africa and potentially what we're seeing in Palestine, Israel. But I'll allow you to make those comparisons and draw your own conclusions. These are indeed troubled times in our world, and Southern Africa has not escaped from this phenomenon. The events in Southern Africa within our tenure as representatives and now more currently as ADs has caused us to pause and to look about and listen to the people in Southern Africa as they start to re-examine their own social, economic, educational, political, and institutions in the country of South Africa. And a large majority of the people cannot escape the reality that all is not well, and it's impacting them every day. The challenges include, that are not limited to, in Angola, absorbing refugees, including many Mennonites who are now fleeing the DRC to Angola, Lesotho with the democratic uncertainty and the high rates of HIV/AIDS, and the same as well for Swaziland. Mozambique, where a large $2 billion secret debt has just been revealed that is going to plunge the country into certainly financial uncertainty. And then Zimbabwe, which is now in a process of macroeconomic meltdown. Our MCC office last week, for the first time, was unable to access cash in its account from the local banks, because essentially they have run out of money. But this morning this afternoon, we want to focus on post-apartheid South Africa. In recent years, books authored by prominent South Africans have come across with titles like this: What's Gone Wrong on the Brink of a Failed State? And We Have Now Begun Our Descent: How to Stop South Africa Losing Its Way. These books have started to appear and to be widely read within South Africa's society. Alex Boraine was one of the main architects of the TRC, and he was a deputy chairman along with the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And he was a witness to the worst years of apartheid. Now, 2 decades later, he is articulating the question, what has gone wrong? Justice Malala, one of South Africa's most well-known political commentators, wrote the following in We Have Now Begun Our Descent. He has said this: I am angry, I am furious, because I never thought it would happen to us. Not us, the Rainbow Nation, that defied doomsayers and suckled and nurtured a fragile democracy into life for its children. I never thought it would happen to us, this relentless decline, the flirtation with a leap over the cliff. Sadly, more and more people are echoing these words in post-apartheid South Africa. Living in post-apartheid South Africa has been a fascinating and at times troubling experience for Joan and I. The above-noted quotes from Boraine and Malala provides one a sense of the troubles. We are frequently witnesses to the effects of apartheid, long after its demise in 1994. The term apartheid is Afrikaans for separation or apartness, and it gained currency among Afrikaner racial theorist in the 1930s and became the basis of government policy with the election of the Nationalist Party in 1948, which incidentally coincides with the founding of Israel. Interestingly, until recently, there was a prominent billboard across from the O.R. Tambo International Airport tarmac, where Israeli airplanes are parked, encouraging South Africans to join the boycott against the apartheid Israel. In South Africa, apartheid was a system of enforced segregation based on race or ethnicity, put in place by an exclusive, self-defined group in order to consolidate colonial conquest, and in particular to reinforce its hold on the land and on natural resources. Although comparisons between Israel and South Africa stretch back to the early 1960s, in the past decade there has been a growing conversation within South Africa that Israel's policies could be and should be characterized as apartheid. As recently as July 2017, a delegation of 9 church leaders from the South African Council of Churches, the SACC, visited Palestine to deliver a message from the SACC National Conference. And the letter reads as follows, which Joan will read.
Based on the information before us, it is clear that Israel is structured in a way that fits and even surpasses the description of an apartheid state, which robs Palestinians of their citizenship and treats them in a discriminatory way. With our experience of apartheid that the whole world recognized and condemned as a crime against humanity, we see the treatment of the Palestinians by Israel as worse than apartheid. We are concerned that the world that condemned apartheid has closed its eyes to the pain and suffering of Palestinians in the occupied areas. We decry the fact that the Palestinians have been occupied for 50 years now without any sign of an end to this occupation. We strongly condemn this illegal and unjust occupation of the land of Palestine, the violation of your rights and human dignity, the destruction of your sources of livelihoods, and the demolition of your homes and properties. We reject the wall of division and separation that cuts through the homes and alienates Palestinian properties. We condemn most forcefully the blockage of the Gaza Strip, turning the area into the largest prison in the world. As we experienced apartheid, we do not want another people, and definitely not those who live in the Holy Land, to have their humanity diminished because of external, cultural, and other factors. We affirm once again that in Christ there is neither Palestinian nor Israeli, and that you are one in Christ Jesus. Any system that says and acts otherwise, we reject with all our might and pray for the day when you will be completely equal in the land that Christ chose to pitch his tent among us. We are wondering if the ultimate answer is not a single, non-racial and secular state where a person's race, ethnicity, and faith have no determination of the human worth and citizenship of the individual, and where all can worship freely and appreciate the cultural diversity that enriches society. We do understand that for many Jewish people all over the world, and certainly in Israel, there is a traditional narrative that sees Arab people as perpetual enemies, and that is forever suspicious, mistrustful, and hateful of what they consider to be the historically hostile attitude of Christians towards the Jews. Many see Christian fervor and blame for the crucifixion of Jesus as the ideological genesis of the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust and its despicable industrial extermination of no less than 6 million Jews. Their justification of the unacceptable conduct of Israel is the never again response to historical Jewish discrimination and persecution. We are encouraged that in the face of all that you have endured over decades, you have chosen to manifest in the best way you can the gospel love that the first century Jewish rabbi Jesus gave to you and to us. We urge you to continue to strengthen and grow the Christian community in Palestine and Israel, and to allow the gospel of love to continue to penetrate for the sake of all in the Holy Land. We know that the way that we and other Christians understand and interpret texts in the Bible is key to your and our liberation. Indeed, the liberation of Christian theology. We remain hopeful, not because of our strength, but because of Christ, that your oppression will not be permanent, but that the love of God will turn hearts of stone into hearts of flesh, in Israel and Palestine and across the world, to move you from the darkness of oppression to the light of freedom.
Thank you. It's telling that the church, who was at the vanguard of the struggle, says what they are seeing in Israel is not apartheid, but worse than apartheid. It's a very telling statement in their letter. The South African and Israeli situation obviously is very complex. And we make no pretensions to understand the complexities in South Africa, let alone Israel, where we have never lived. We continue to actively listen and ask questions, cognizant of the warning in Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of the Single Story. Likely, historical comparison is more useful in sharpening questions rather than providing meaningful answers, such as, does the South African anti-apartheid struggle offer any lessons for the Palestinian solidarity work that MCC's partners are engaged in today? Does MCC's history in conscientious objection support groups offer anything to young Israeli men and women today? Although the 1994 transition in South Africa dismantled legal white supremacy, South Africa clearly remains a profoundly divided society wrapped by unresolved questions of race, class, and gender inequality. The work of fully understanding the historical experience of apartheid and addressing its continuing legacies is far from complete. The TRC was only the tip of the proverbial iceberg. South Africa continues to remain and is a very hurting society with a lot of frustration and anger that has contributed to violence being normalized in society. Homes and businesses in South Africa have become virtual fortresses with large walls, razor wire, and security systems. Private security firms in South Africa currently employ about 500,000 people. That's one security personnel for every person in South Africa. Or, pardon me, one security personnel for every 106 people in South Africa. It has a population of 53 million people. Any lessons the South African transition offers for the future of Israel and Palestine are far from simple, which brings us back to the danger of the single story. Adichie's words of caution are an important reminder of the responsibility we have as MCC service workers to tell stories well and to be sensitive to how power shapes which stories we tell and how we tell them, defining power as the ability not to just tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of another person. Adichie sees stereotypes as complicit in the perpetuation of single stories. She says, the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Adichie also reminds us of how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story. Joan and I are grateful to the practical insight of Adichie's words to reflect upon our life and service in South Africa and Southern Africa. It is for this reason, when we invited people to be part of the first South Africa MCC Advisory Committee, we included people from the Black, colored, Indian, and white communities who were also Christian, from the Anabaptist, Quaker, and Pentecostal persuasions, as well as Muslim and Hindu to be part of our advisory committee. All of them were committed to the peace witness. It's telling that we still use racial classifications, even this story to you. When we talk about black, white, colored, and Indian, it is still very much part of South African society, a legacy of the apartheid past. If I were a South African resident today, my national identification number, which all South Africans must have, would be 550617, 5075085. That would tell you the year of my birth, the month of my birth, the date of my birth, the color of my skin, and my gender. Why, in a post-apartheid South Africa, do we still need to know the color of one's skin? The legacy carries on. When we first registered to open a bank account in South Africa, there was a series of questions. And one of the questions was, what racial group do you belong to? And we were able to fill in the different blanks. And Joan asked the teller, what if we will not indicate our racial group? And the answer was, then you won't get a bank account. And it was as simple as that. Adichie's phrase, the danger of a single story, gives us, as service workers in South Africa, a simple, direct way to develop or to begin developing our sensitivity to narrative and power. We may begin our service assignments attuned to one-sided viewpoints, biases, and unheard stories, but need to be ever mindful of thinking about whose perspective is being served by the way a particular story is being heard. From our experience in leading learning tours in South Africa, we have learned that participants sometimes want to chalk up divergent opinions to different perspectives, rather than investigating the accuracy of a story. Our role, as we have seen it, is to move from this simple kind of reduction and open up the possibility that the danger of a single story lies not in reference to a different perception of the facts, but in reference to the story's legitimacy and authenticity. In doing so, it opens up conversations about the ways in which history is a composite of stories, some true, some not, some unheard, promoted, or silenced by those in power, which requires reflective analysis. We have been guided in our work in South Africa by a starting assumption that we have learned from the Quakers on our advisory committee, and that is, perhaps I might be wrong. This simple operating assumption has given us the freedom to ask honest and, we hope, respectful questions of others and ourselves to seek clarity and understanding in the society and the context in which we currently live. As we continue experience living in South Africa, the ancient call, where will our help come from, of the psalmist in Psalm 121 seems applicable at this time. It expresses something of a yearning and desperation, almost on the brink of despair. The Bahrains, Malalas, Tutus, and other voices for some time have warned of the ticking time bomb in South Africa, embedded in South Africa. And here and there, the country has experienced a time bomb of inequality, coupled with high rates of unemployment, in particular with the youth, which is running about 72%, already exploding during continual service delivery protests across the country. Local communities are in different stages of disintegration. Elsewhere in Scripture, a psalmist advises not to trust princes, which is equally advisable in the South African context. The current political leadership is continually failing the majority, although, as we have seen around the world, this phenomenon is not unique and just limited to South Africa. In post-apartheid South Africa, control is almost a fetish, just as it was with the white nationalist government pre-1994. It is not sufficient to control members of parliament. Even mayors of towns and cities have to have their sanction. Provincial premiers are elected by the Thule House, which is the African National Congress headquarters, and all those who hold any office are all times under tight supervision. This echoes back to the times of apartheid. Another page is turned, but it's being shared by a different government from the past. The executive of the state has been replaced by the top 6 ANC leaders. Nothing happens without rigid control and deployment to ensure that loyal cadres are in place. The aim remains the exercise of power at every level of the nation. Of course, there are many good people within the ANC party, both at leadership level and in the rank and file. And many of these faithful supporters of the ANC are deeply embarrassed and perhaps even ashamed by the failure of the senior leadership. But the culture of power seems to be so ingrained in genuine and extensive reform, it appears to be simply out of the question. What is needed is a new coalition within South Africa to give the country a fresh start and enable it to return to the period which has been termed the Mandela years. It is the ANC's current obsession with power that engenders a culture of suspicion, distrust, and extreme intolerance, which is a legacy of the apartheid past. This was evident in the ANC's period of exile and accounts today for the party's disenchantment with the Constitutional Court and much of the media and its contempt for Parliament. And in exile, it could be argued that the ANC had good cause to be paranoid and lacking in transparency. After all, the movement seemed to be riddled with the apartheid state security agents. But 23 years later, the same phobias exist, and the ANC is no longer an exile movement, but the government of South Africa. The leadership has not yet learned the lesson that a besieged movement in exile is not the same as a democratically elected government. Is this perhaps a lesson also for Palestine? Well, some are still struggling to decipher the writing on the wall. For others with a long vision for the country, it's been clear for a while that doing business as usual in the South African context is simply unsustainable. It seemed that South Africa needs to commit to at least 2 things simultaneously: saving a failing state and the absence of leadership, which decisively uproots corruption and to foster social cohesion, and secondly, responding to poverty and youth unemployment with political conviction. Now to the question that begs to be asked: in which direction should South Africa be looking for help? The robustness of the media and courts have been encouraging over the past months, with Parliament showing signs of bouncing back and civil society regrouping in new formations, including the South African Council of Churches, which seems to be finding its voice again. Political analysis, Dr. Samadoda Fikeni, says South Africa suffers from an honesty deficit, and Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa recently acknowledged that the governing party must regain its moral power. According to Ramaphosa, at its recent policy conference, the ANC was reminded of its true nature and character. He continued that the church community, through the South African Council of Churches, and through its report on state capture, was calling the ANC back to its true tradition and values. In the process of looking for a moral compass, returning to basic values, it's indeed a good place to start. Ramaphosa rightfully acknowledges the church's role in being bearers of the values one wants to see furthered in the nation, despite South Africa's identity of being that of a secular democracy. Perhaps he also thought back to the fact that the ANC once occupied the moral high ground in the nation, and it was established in church buildings in Bloemfontein many years back. It is interesting to note that in the aforementioned letter that Joan read, they stated in the letter, if the ultimate answer, parenthetically I add, for Palestine, is not a single non-racial secular state where a person's race, ethnicity, and faith have no determination of the human worth and citizenship of the individual, and where all can worship freely and appreciate the cultural diversity that enriches society. But how to regain a moral compass? Churches and other religious institutions are not by all means the only carriers of the values that South Africans so desperately seek, but they form an important part of the fabric of society. With mass grassroots supports and can indeed contribute to the recovery of certain values. The challenge to them would be whether they can so universalize some of the specific values from within their particular faith traditions in order to equally meet other traditions, including people ascribing to no particular faith, which is the reality of living in a pluralistic society like South Africa. And in the process, they'll still have to maintain the necessary distance to the powers that be so that their prophetic witness isn't undermined in the process. There have been excellent examples of this in the past, not only of how it has been practically lived out in multi-faith South African communities, but also in how the anti-apartheid struggle succeeded in galvanizing energy from different traditions to make common cause. Post-apartheid South Africans, however, have also discovered how difficult it is to maintain cohesiveness in the face of the multiplication of struggles and the pull to return of faith and denominational silos. With all this said, it wouldn't be as simple a solution to now turn towards the church or other religions for an easy fix for the moral dilemma that South Africans find themselves in. Moral veracity and resilience isn't something that can be tendered out to another institution in sudden desperation. It is something nurtured over significant time and will not be achieved overnight. While the South African Council of Churches has realized the country's future cannot be left in the hands of the ANC any longer, as a country, South Africans will have to take a hard look into the mirror to establish what has brought them to this current state of affairs. This has to do with the apartheid history and more recent past, which has somehow produced people who have lost their connection with their own humanity, and with that of others from the top echelons of power downwards. This is indeed an important lesson to be learned for Palestine and Israel, we think. So what does one do with all of this? Back in November 21, after the events of September 11, David Schrader encouraged the MCC Canada board, in times of struggle and confusion in the world, to go back to the basics. I periodically reflect on the basics that David articulated at that board meeting as a fount of encouragement when I witness and read of events in South Africa. The basic affirmations of our faith help me look beyond the confusing events in which I live and work and give me a reboot. These basics include, firstly, God is sovereign Lord. God is sovereign Lord of the universe. God is creator and sustainer of the cosmos. God has not abandoned the created order. God has not abandoned humankind or any of the people of God. And God has not resigned from lordship over the world and is active in world events now as always. Secondly, God is a God of love and peace. God created life and also created the ecosystems and is creator and supporting the ongoing life on earth. In love and wisdom, God created persons in the image of God, persons that could relate and respond to God's love. God desired that there should be fullness of life, a shalom, and is a shalom for all people and all living things. Thirdly, God is a God of righteousness and justice. God created the world as an expression of his character and will. As a result, God created a moral order, an order of righteousness and justice. God called that which was in harmony with the will of God good, and that which was against God's will and purpose evil. As a consequence of this moral order, the good will be rewarded, and the evil that people will do will be met with judgment. This holds true whether people recognize this to be the case or not. It holds true even where people believe they are doing good, but are mistaken about what is good. This moral order is not set by humans, but by God. It is revealed in Scripture, in Jesus Christ, and in all that God has made so that people are without excuse. And fourthly, God is a saving, redeeming God. God's will is that all people should come to a saving knowledge of God. God is at work in the world, seeking to overcome human sin, rejection, and rebellion against God. God came to humankind in Jesus in order to seek and to save the lost. Jesus came not to rule, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. God created us as responsible persons and invited us to cooperate with him in the governance of the world. God invited us to participate in sustaining the created order, to till and to keep the garden. We have been given dominion over the things God has created. In this, God was requesting that humans share with God the governance of the world. This was not an invitation to lord over the world, but an invitation to participate with God in working towards life and fullness of life, working towards that shalom in the world. And we see this in the work of our partners and service workers throughout Southern Africa and beyond. There are stories in our files of hope in post-apartheid South Africa, Lesotho, and Swaziland, and we rejoice in those stories, and we seek comfort and joy from them. And they include many things, including peace clubs in interracial schools, interracial ecumenical partnerships, and a desire in South Africa to understand more, in particular about the Anabaptist peace theology that might be lived out in the current context of South Africa. As Christians, we are called to be the salt and the light. And if we don't have hope for a new heaven and a new earth, then who will? To express that hope, we need to continue to say yes to the power of love expressed locally, nationally, and internationally. Yes to building bridges between peoples, races, cultures, faiths, and nations. Yes to forgiveness, and yes to the way of peace. In closing, as we reflect on post-apartheid South Africa and modern-day Palestine, Israel, and beyond these two countries, and as our service speaks hope into the world, we want to draw on the words of Isaiah and the Apostle Paul for that encouragement. In Isaiah 54:2, it reads, "Enlarge the place of your tent. Stretch your curtains wide. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords. Strengthen your stakes." In Isaiah 58:11, "The Lord God will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail." And from Hebrews 12:2, let us keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, on whom our faith depends from beginning to end. Thank you for this opportunity to share with you this morning our reflections.
Do I come back and join you, James, Joan? Thank you. You've heard some indication of our appreciation. Yeah, you've taken some of the thorniest stuff that we deal with at MCC, I think, and tried to give us some grounding without putting easy band-aids on it. So thank you. I know they're going to be reflecting on this again next week at MCC Canada's annual meeting, where they're going to be part of a broader panel of people reflecting on Palestine as well. So thank you again. And it was my treat to travel with you folks. And I don't know how many of you know this game, but Louise and I taught this game to James, and one of James and Joan's mission for coming to Ontario was to make sure they didn't leave.
Thank you. Mission accomplished.
Can't leave yet, but now I know some folks have been slipping out, others may have to go. But questions? What has this sparked for you? Are there comments you want to make? You went often, James, to the danger of a single story, which I think lots of people here will be familiar with that, both the TED Talk and the notion. But this is a chance for you to speak into this. Ron, do we want to have a traveling mic for this? Or not?
Thanks, James and Joan. Very informative report. Very sobering as well. You call for search for a moral compass. You talk a lot about politics and about the church. President Zuma just survived an ANC conference. Will he survive? And who will follow him? Is Cyril Ramaphosa or Zuma Lamidi? Who's going to win the next election? And what would the SACC? Easy questions first. And the SACC, you say they're starting to find their voice. How vigorous are they? Can they develop a moral voice within the Senate?
Can you just summarize Ron's questions, just because it didn't get into a mic?
Okay.
Not that that's an easy thing to do.
Ron is asking about where is and what is that moral compass in South Africa right now? Is it coming from can it come from the government? Can it come from the church? Does the church have sufficient momentum to carry the voice? Is that accurate, Ron? South African Council of Churches for a long time has partnered, or MCC has walked alongside the South African Council of Churches, in particular during the struggle. Until recently, the General Executive Director of the South African Council of Churches was an MCC IBET alumni, who is now retired and now created his own NGO. After apartheid, or during apartheid and during the struggle, the church was very much part of the vanguard of the struggle. And then after the struggle, after 1994, they got sidelined, and deliberately by the government as successive presidents came along, and certainly by the most recent president, Jacob Zuma, who has created another church voice of church leaders who are more sympathetic to him, and they more or less become his praise singers. And so there's a tension between the larger churches in South Africa as to who is carrying that moral compass, that legitimacy to speak into the context of modern day South Africa. Where that will come out, I'm not sure. I think the South African Council of Churches is regaining its footing. It still has a long way to go. The evangelical, charismatic, Pentecostal movement is very strong and growing in South Africa. That may be the cutting edge, I think, in the church. But out of that voice also are some very prominent individuals, but they're not really ready yet to step forward because they're not sure the rest of the church is following in behind them. And they're not willing to step into the sort of the forefront yet until they know people behind them are with them. So it's very fractured. The state is very much like the apartheid state, running agents through the different estates of the country, setting things off balance, basically. The president currently is the head of the security apparatus in the government, where the military, the Secret Service, and the police all report to him. He's the sort of the chairperson of that cohort, and he is the former head of the ANC intelligence services when they were in exile. So a very astute politician, has all the dirt on all the leaders in South Africa from his previous existence as the head of security of the ANC. People are in fear of him, and so he has very tight control, which is exactly the way the apartheid government worked. You know, the different players, same playbook, and that's very worrying for many people now in South Africa. I'm not sure I've answered all your questions there.
I don't think you called the election.
Okay, the election is going to be interesting. I mentioned Cyril Ramaphosa, and President Jacob Zuma's former wife is also in the forefront of running for the presidency. Jacob Zuma has approximately 750 charges against him, ranging from defying the Constitution to rape, and everything that you can imagine in between. He is desperately trying to get his former wife into the presidency in order to protect him from potentially going to the International Court of Justice for some of the things, and certainly before the South African court system. So there's a lot of power at work here to try and keep the status quo. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting year. President Jacob's term ends at the end of in December. The elections will be in 2018. So we'll see. It's anyone's guess right now.
Thank you. Others?
What I just add to, in terms of the moral voice, there was a secular moral voice by the man named Jonathan Jansen. He was the vice chancellor of the University of the Free State. He comes out of the colored community. Again, that's anyone that's not black, white, or Indian in the South African context. And he was very much willing to step forward into the breach, to call the government to task, also to affirm them when that was appropriate, but got really, in a very dramatic way, he modeled what it is to express grace in the South African society. There was a very disturbing incident at the University of Free State between some white students and some black employees of the university that was absolutely appalling. Yet Jansen was able to model a process of reconciliation and develop this reconciling process between these white university boys and these black workers, and he got trounced on by the government because of the way he modeled this concept of grace. The people were wanting him to hammer these white boys, and he was not willing to do that. He was looking for reconciliation and restoration of relationships. And so that was one of the very prominent moral voices in many different ways. That's just a very simple example, but it was a very powerful one. But he got called to task on it because people did not, and the government at this point does not want to see reconciliation between peoples. It's their wedge, and they're using that wedge as best as they can. And we see the wedge growing larger in South Africa right now. The government last year hired a very prominent British public relations firm to work on their behalf. And one of their strategies was to develop a slogan called white capitalist monopoly. And that white capitalist monopoly was destroying South Africa, keeping the black, colored, and Indian folks from enjoying the natural resources and benefits that are accrue in a free and democratic state. And it was just an absolute cynical process of trying to split people apart rather than the Mandela vision of having the rainbow nation where all were free and equal in the country. And it got exposed. But they were just loading up social media with this slogan, white capitalist monopoly is running away with our nation, which harkened back to, there's an element of truth that certainly whites still control a significant portion of the South African economy, but this was being used as a wedge issue to drive people apart, and it was a very cynical ploy by the government.
So there's the question, I have one. Use TRC a few times. When you're in Canada, the first thing I think of is our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which of course was borrowed from South Africa. We're still in, not the midst of it, but it's still, its outcomes are still being felt, I think, in Canada, many of them very positive. Because of your work at comparing Palestine-Israel with post-apartheid South Africa, do you want to ask any questions or reflect at all on the value of something like that, which, as I understood it in South Africa, was unlike this Jansen's experience, where when there was some attempt to reconcile, that's squashed. I think what's part of the understanding of the TRC is that there will be some openness to reconciliation if truth is told. I don't have a really precise question, but what are some of the potentials of that in a place like Palestine?
Let me just come back to the experience in South Africa. The TRC, I think many people recognize, was a good starting point, but it was not concluded. It was terminated in many people's minds too soon, and it did not address all of the issues and the difficulties and the traumas that were in South African society. In part, it mostly was white on black issues. There are many people saying, are asking, well, what about black on black? Black on Indian, and all those other racial groups that also were in conflict with one another and perpetuated harm and hurt in the communities. And interesting enough, you hear more frequently people speak discouragingly of the TRC than encouragingly of it. And there's a sense of not despair, but people that were optimistic, sort of the young adults that came out of the '94 experience now are more pessimistic than they have ever been in South Africa. So the TRC, yes, I think people would say, it was a good start, but it was concluded too soon, and it needs to be moved along. The other thing that's interesting in South Africa is, around the world, people recognize Nelson Mandela, and he's an honorary citizen of Canada, for instance. But we're hearing more and more young people speak of him disparagingly, which is really countercultural. So there's a dramatic shift going on where elders were highly respected, but now we're hearing young people speaking of Mandela as the old man, and not in a familiar, kindly way. And we're hearing things that, he was a sellout to the whites, and certainly the economic freedom fighters headed up by a split off from the ANC is certainly casting or tarnishing Mandela's reputation. And so we're hearing that more, which is very surprising and very counterculture to the respect that elders are held in African society. So a transition is happening in modern South Africa. So with respect to Israel-Palestine, I imagine at some point something like that will have to happen, but it'll have to be true to that context.
We don't want to cut this off, but I'm also happy to let it go to its informal stage where people can hang around. So again, thank you very much for your preparation and depth of sharing with us here. And if you can stay I know you can stay around a little bit. If others can, please come and have some further conversation with James and Joan.